Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University.
Namaskar friends, I am Dr. Kesan Joshi and today I am here for another video lecture of the same paper that we have been dealing with. So this is going to be the last and the fourth video lecture of the whole series that we talked about. Once again, as I said, it is the fourth part of the video lecture of this particular unit. The title of the unit is Literary Movements 1. What is literary movement and role of it in shaping the literature? So this is going to be the last part of this paper. Friends, today we are going to talk about certain literary movements as part of history of English literature. So we are going to talk about Irish movement, modernism, Dadaism, war poetry, imagism, Harlem Renaissance in America, surrealism, postmodernism, beat poetry, magic realism, post-colonialism. Questions for discussion, obviously, as part of our video lecture. Every video lecture we do talk about some of the questions that we can discuss after the video lecture and references for you, the students. So we shall start with the first movement that we are going to talk about, that is Irish movement. So as part of this movement, this started somewhere in the late 19th century, as it is mentioned here, and it was literary renaissance, especially in drama. So this we can see, this Irish movement we can see somewhere in drama in particular. So the Irish Movement Society was established. As part of this movement, Irish Literary Society was established and the pioneers of the movement began to deal with Irish materials, settings and culture. So as part of this movement, the prominent aspects which were talked about were Irish material, Irish setting and Irish culture. In fact, the part of the national movement for independence, we can consider Irish movement as part of the independent movement. In the beginning of the 20th century, there were certain minds who contributed to this movement. They were W.B. Yeats, Lady Gregory and Morgan. So they started this Irish dramatic movement because when I said Irish dramatist movement, Irish movement itself had a very strong influence over drama. They revived Irish drama, which was highly poetic and imaginative. So both words are very important as part of Irish movement. So they were highly poetic and imaginative. It was also a revolt against some of the social plays which were written by especially two main authors, G.B. Shaw, George Bernard Shaw and Galsworth. So they were the people who wrote many plays, but most of the plays, probably all the plays, were somewhere dealing with some social issues, some social problems. So they were against those problem plays in that way. They also revived some of the Irish legends, folklores, and somewhere as part of their writing, their creation, Irish life and characters were revived. So they did talk about Irish life and characters. And the pioneers of the movement used symbolic technique. So as part of this movement, the writers, the contributors, they often, most of the time, they were using symbolic techniques. The Irish Literary Society reconstructed the Abbey Theatre, a very famous one, wherein Yeats, Synge and Lady Gregory, they came together, they had a meet there, they discussed some of the related issues, and finally they come up with something new and very lucid and interesting. It played great role in reviving Irish culture and literature. So Irish movement, it revolved around Ireland, Irish literature, Irish life, Irish culture, Irish character. So next movement that we are going to talk about is modernism. Modernism, postmodernism, we have been listening to these words, but when it comes to how this modernism came into existence and everything, we need to know that this literary movement emerged in England around 1910 as a reaction against Romanticism in the wake of the First World War. So two events are very important. So the first thing is, it is a reaction against modernism, it is a reaction against Romanticism, and there is a strong influence of First World War over this movement, particular movement that we are talking about, that is modernism. Modernist literature is characterized by anti-Romanticism, obviously, as it was a reaction to this. It concerned with form, complexity and intellectual slant, wit, a use of wit, irony, paradox and conceit. So these were some of the features of modernism. It is also concerned with stream of consciousness in narration, focus on psychological investigations instead of focusing on plot, and blend of high and low language. So most of the time it dealt with something new, unique of that time. Modernism is divided into two particular parts, pre-war and post-war. And as we know, when we talk about World War, we must know that when it started and when it ended. So it started somewhere in 1914 and it ended in 1918. So this period is a very crucial kind of a, it was very crucial kind of a period in the history of humankind. And this came up with that kind of an idea, trauma and everything that people were feeling of people living in that time were feeling these kind of things. Many movements simultaneously, they also came up with, along with modernism, some of the movements of this particular period were like war poetry, imagism, Dadaism, apocalyptic movement, end of the world and everything, surrealism, stream of consciousness and many more. And most of the time this age was considered to be the age of anxiety, interrogation and despair. And we know disparity is a sin in that way. And this movement, modernism movement, when we talk about this was a very gloomy kind of a state of mind of people who were involved in this, just because of some of the problems going on around the world, problems in humanity. So there were certain writers as well who contributed to this movement. The prominent one are here. When we talk about Thomas Hardy was a poet of this early modernism whose poems were very dark and had a very pessimistic tone. As we just discussed, that humanity was not on a balanced platform, and obviously this was a very obvious kind of mood that we can imagine that what they must have felt at that time, living in that particular era or age. T.S. Eliot, a very famous literary person, is regarded as the father of modern poetry, and his poem that is very famous, The Wasteland, deeply touched the British and American people who themselves identified as people who are experiencing something called the sense of alienation, disparity, meaninglessness of life and everything. So in that way, when the audience was feeling such, obviously T.S. Eliot's this work based on modernistic approach, modern movement, modernism, was quite obvious that it would appeal the audience of both Britain and America. Modernism continued till World War II and affected literature, art and thought of period profoundly. The next one, very interesting one, Dadaism. The name is very unique in that way, but the movement itself is extremely unique. Dadaism was an art movement. There were certain movements which came into art first and then moved to literature. Obviously, literature is a part of art, and art also complements literature at a certain level. So this Dadaism was a movement that came into art first, and it came into existence during the First World War in Zurich. It was again a reaction to the horror of war. Dada poetry and the art of satirical and nonsensical in nature. So the poetry which were written through this approach were satirical and nonsensical in nature. Hans Arp wrote to this particular movement. He was involved in this. So how he described the trauma of the time was, while guns rumbled in the distance, we sang, painted, made collages and wrote poems with all our might. So this statement itself says everything about the time, the era that they were living in, the kind of trauma that they were suffering from and everything. So the founder of the Dadaism was Hugo Ball. There are certain pronunciation of this. A writer who started magazine named Dada. The movement formed the basics of Surrealism. So Surrealism is once again a kind of a movement that came into art first, and this magazine, this movement created a kind of a base for this movement, the another movement to start. The leading artists of the movement were Hans Arp, Marcel Duchamp, Francis Picabia and Kurt Schwitters. The names are quite unique in that way. Kurt Schwitters. When we talk about certain characteristics of this movement, they are, as we just talked about, they were they were sarcastic. एक मिनट. Okay. When we talk about characteristics of Dadaism, as we said, they were sarcastic in nature and they were quite nonsensical, never follow any kind of known rules. They used to assemble things, they used to make collage, and they used to use some of the ready-made objects. So when it comes to Dadaism, these were the characteristics of this movement. The movement was influenced by abstractions and impressionism, and it influenced cubism, a very unique kind of movement in art, and to a lesser extent futurism. The another movement that we need to learn, that we can discuss, is war poetry. Now the name itself suggests that this movement would have started somewhere because of the trauma of world wars. World War I, as I've said, 1914 to 18 was one of the most horrible events in the history of humankind in the 20th century. More than 41 million people lost their lives. This was the casualty that is recorded. Hundreds of poets wrote during this time, during the time of wars, and they dealt with some of the tragic that they experienced in that particular era. There were some soldiers who wrote about the tragedy of war and patriotic spirit. So they were feeling from both the kinds of senses, experiences. They had some patriotic spirit in them. They had some tragedy of wars. They must have experienced some tragedy of wars at the same time. The early poets often endorsed the cause of wars, the reasons and everything about the war, emphasized the notion of honor and patriotism in their writing. The late poets, the later one, the new generation, the new poets that came as part of this movement, they express the anti-war attitude depicting horror of war. So within the same movement, war poetry, we can see different kinds of writers. There were certain writers, poets, who were not in that way favor of wars, but they saw war as from their patriotic spirit, and there were people who were against war at the same time. So Rupert Brooke is a very famous war poet, and he himself has written many war poems, and he also died early in the war. Wilfred Owen and Isaac Rosenberg described the frantic and painful experience or nature of war and the injury in war that they must have might be personally experienced, but from the experiences of people suffering, they must have felt this, and they have depicted injury in their writing, in their poems. So injury became the major theme of war poetry. So here three names are very important: Rupert Brooke, Wilfred Owen, and Isaac Rosenberg. War poets, they were also known as, they are also popular as trench poets. They question the idea of war itself, heroism and patriotism. The war poets of the late period, war was, they felt that war was inhuman, war was brutal, and the result of so-called patriotism. So as I've said, within this movement we had many minds watching war, observing war from different point of view. The another movement is Imagism. Now Imagism was a movement in early 20th century which came in Anglo-American poetry. It was born in England, this movement I am talking about. It came into existence in England and America in reaction to once again Romanticism and Victorian poetry. It emphasized simplicity, clarity of expression, and the precision through the use of images. As the name itself is Imagism, it had a very strong influence of using images in their writing. Ezra Pound, once again a very well-known person, writer, is regarded as the founder of the Imagism. Ezra Pound adopted Hume's, a very famous critique, Hume's idea on poetry for his Imagist movement. Imagist is a strand of modernism. When I say it's a strand of modernism, it's a very different side of modernism. It's very opposite to modernism in that way, which aimed at replacing abstractions, which was very important in modernism, with concrete images. Where in modernism, something was very vague in expression, nothing was clear, as there was so much struck with the kind of trauma of war, they thought of expressing their ideas, their minds, their state of mind in different way. But at the same time, in Imagism, they were quite different from modernism. Ezra Pound defined image as the presentation of an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. In an instant of time. Sorry. Ezra Pound defined image as the presentation of an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. Now, when we talk about characteristics of Imagism, they are, there is a list of this, we have got 10. Direct treatment of the thing, that's one characteristic. Musical quality, no rhythmic pattern, free verse, exactness, the precision, compression, freedom in choice of subject, suggest rather than rather to offer complete sentence. They used to suggest rather than writing the whole sentence, expressing everything in a sentence. They would suggest something, and to avoid cliche, something that has been people have been doing this, so they wanted to do something new. Ezra Pound, Emil Lowell, Carl Sandburg, William Carlo Williams, Hilda Doolittle are some of the prominent poets of this movement. Though the movement did not last long, it couldn't survive for a long period of time, Imagism deeply influenced modernist poetry in England, in English literature. The another one, very important one, is Harlem Renaissance in America. Here the word Harlem is very important, that we will definitely talk about. In early part of 20th century, African American, people would also call them Afro Americans, but they would prefer themselves, they would prefer them to call African American in Africa, sorry, they would prefer us to call them African American, wherein they felt in America, living in America, they felt racism, violence and legal segregation. So there were no we can say that there were very less privileges that they were getting from the society that they were living in. They moved to northern states in large number as they were feeling imparity, they were feeling not balanced kind of behavior. They moved to northern states in a very huge number and settled in Harlem area. It's an area that they settled down in New York. There was an extremely, we can say that there was a surge of creativity and intellectual in Harlem. So people came up with extremely creative and intellectual work as they were. It was a flowering of Negro Renaissance. It is also known as Negro movements most of the time, or the Negro Renaissance. It is said to have begun in the late 1910 and ended in somewhere in 1930. The Harlem Renaissance was characterized by lyricism, formal innovation and celebration of African American identity. So when we talk about Harlem Renaissance, in this literature certain people, they have projected themselves rather than talking about something alien. The major literary figures of this movement were Langston Hughes, Jean Thomas, Anna Bontemps, Countee Cullen, and Angelina Weld Grimke, Claude Mackay, Neela Larson, James Weldon Johnson, Zora Neale Hurston. So they are very unique kind of names, but they were very prominent writers in that way. As part of Harlem Renaissance, they contributed immensely. The Harlem Renaissance made impact in civil rights movement of the late 1940s and 1950s, wherein the kind of artistic revolution that we can see somewhere happen in Harlem. Harlem Renaissance was profoundly affected by primitivism and as we all know, Sigmund Freud's psychology, theory of Sigmund Freud, the ideas of Sigmund Freud and everything. So it affected African American music like blues, and we do know that even the dance form hip hop is also a gift of Harlem Renaissance. Jazz music is also a part of this movement. Surrealism. Surrealism is a cultural movement that began in 1920s. It is the best known for its visual artwork and writings. It flourished in Europe between World War I and II. So this is another movement that came into first art and then literature. Surrealism emphasized positive expression in reuniting consciousness, unconsciousness, realms and experience, dreams and fantasy. Andrew Britton published the Surrealist Manifesto in 1924, and this text is considered to be the very important text of this movement. Now when we talk about characteristics of Surrealism, they were elements of surprise. We could see the elements of surprise in the writing, unexpected juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is something that we have never even imagined. Distortion of reality. Reality is not presented as it is or as we see it, we perceive it. Dream-like subject matters. Psychological rather than logical. Delving deep into the subconscious, bizarre and weird portrayal of reality. The major poets, painters and artists of these movements were Salvador Dali, René Magritte, Pablo Picasso, a very known person, Andrew Britton and John Miro. So these were the people who contributed to this movement. Surrealism was amply influenced by the writing of, as I have said, Sigmund Freud and his concept of conscious, subconsciousness and unconsciousness. Surrealism was a revolution against the constraints of the national mind and oppressive influence. It was a kind of a reaction to these kind of mindsets or ideologies. Now when I talk about postmodernism, postmodernism came into performance after the end of World War II. It is a form of literature which relies on fragmentation, paradox, unrealistic plots, unreliable narrators. We can see parody, dark humor, magic realism and many other. The postmodern writers reject overwrite meaning and claim that there is a possibility of multiple meanings in their work. So they didn't feel that there is the meaning in the text. They always used to feel that there is always a series of meanings. Whosoever would interpret the text, he or she would be having their own meaning. They also rejected the distinctions between different genres and forms of writing. Now when I talk about characteristics of postmodernism, they were intersexuality, metafiction, non-linear narrative technique, magic realism as we have discussed it in previous lectures, the mixing of actual historical events with fictional events, reader involvement, and many other things. Postmodern literature serves as a reaction to the supposed stylistic and ideological limitations of modernist literature. There were certain writers as part of this movement who are very prominent in that way. Thomas Pincone, Don DeLillo, very different names, Kurt Vonnegut, George Louis Borges, a very famous person, Samuel Beckett, Vladimir Nabokov, David Foster Wallace, and many other. Beat poetry, on a very quick note, if we can understand this, is it was a movement that evolved during 1940s in the New York City and San Francisco City somewhere, and became the heart of the movement in 1950s. The end of World War II, poets like Allen Ginsberg, Gary Sender, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and Gregory Corso, they questioned the mainstream politics and culture. So they were quite revolutionary in their approach. The main features of the movements were battle against social conformity, rejection of literary traditions, the use of drugs to achieve higher consciousness, meditation, interest in Buddhism, and many other. Now when we talk about this movement, it didn't last for a long time span, as people criticized this movement for many reasons, and there were certain reasons like sexual deviancy, illicit drug use, and anti-intellectual stance. The hippie movement of 1960s is once again a very important movement that came into existence because of this beat generation. Magic realism. चालू है? Magic realism. Magic realism is a genre of narrative fiction and more broadly literature, painting, film and theatre. So we can see the effect of magic realism in all these areas, and it is something very unique in a way that writers of this movement, they blended something magical and reality in a way that we fail in a very first sight, we fail to understand whether whatever is shown to us is magical or reality. It makes us believe in what they say. We have got several writers as part of this movement. Emily Bronte, we can see that in Wuthering Heights there is certain element, there are certain elements of magic realism, and Kafka's The Metamorphosis, we can see this. And this movement began in Latin America, and there are certain writers who contributed to this movement immensely. The very famous one, a very major contributor to this movement is Gabriel Garcia Marquez here, and there are many other. Today we can see magic realism as an intellectual movement, an intellectual trend, and when we talk about certain characteristics of this movement, there were situations and there were situations and incidents defy logic. It is very hard to apply logic in this kind of writing. The use of myths and legends, historic context, societal concerns, distorted time and sequence, real world setting, matter of fact tone, blending the naturalistic techniques with the surreal and supernatural, unreal elements play part in realistic environment. When we did talk about what is magic realism, these all things became directly or indirectly part of this genre itself, this movement itself. The ordinary as miraculous and the miraculous as ordinary. So they would present something miraculous in a very ordinary way, and they would present something ordinary in a very miraculous way. So in that way, this movement brings up something very unique. And as we know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is a very famous person, and his 100 Years of Solitude, written in 1964, is considered to be the very important text as part of this movement. Post-colonialism. Post-colonialism or the post-colonial studies is the academic study of cultural legacy of colonialism and imperialism. Now when I say colony, it's a very different kind of a term. In a way, it reminds people of slavery, and something that came up after that time became part of postmodernism. It is the historical period that represents the aftermath, as I've said, of Western colonialism and imperialism over the world in many countries. In India itself, we know that we were the colony of Britishers. The term postmodernism is sometimes used to refer to the struggles of indigenous people, as we Indians, in many parts of the world in the early part of 21st century. Fanon, in his book The Wretched of the Earth, discussed material and psychological consequences of colonialism. So after colonialism, when people were left without any kind of a support and everything, how people would struggle in their life, how people would be feeling in that particular time span, is somewhere is studied as part of this movement. When I talk about characteristics of this movement, the use of native language by the writers, rewriting history, valorizing of cultural identity, nationhood and nationalism, meta-narrative, colonial discourse, decolonization, and the struggle that is involved in that, and challenging stereotypes. So these all kind of things become part of this movement. There were prominent themes of post-colonial writing, and they are reasserting the identity of indigenous culture, revisiting and revising colonial history, depiction of people in the and the lives centered by colonialism, interrogating colonial part, cultural alienation, because when there is a colony, when you're living in a colony by colonizers, you're always moved away from your culture identity. You feel like alienated person from your own culture, from your own identity. Recreation of mimic men, negritude, feminism, Dalitism, queer theory and everything, hybridity and diaspora. These all kind of literature genre themselves become part of post-colonial movement. There are certain writers as part of this and theorists, critiques of post-colonialism. They are Homi Bhabha, Edward Said, Franz Fanon, Gayatri Spivak, Mahasweta Devi, Chinua Achebe, Salman Rushdie, a very famous figure. In fact, everyone is very famous in their writing, in their contribution. Zine Reyes, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Derek Walcott, Dipesh Chakraborty, Ben Okri, and the list would go on and on. Very important texts that we have as part of the contribution that we can see as part of this movement are Things Fall Apart, Why Sargasso Sea, The God of Small Things, Midnight Children, as we know, by Salman Rushdie, Heart of Darkness are the popular post-colonial works. They try to free themselves. It's a very obvious kind of a response that they try to feel free and they try to express themselves free from the colonial hangover and examine their native that they belong to, they were rooted in, and indigenous culture and tradition in their own way, in a very unbiased way. Because most of the time, people living in colony were projected in a very biased way by the colonizers. So friends, those were the movements that we just talked about. So here are certain questions for discussion that you can have. Discuss some of the major characteristics of the movements that we discussed as part of this presentation. Trace out differences between modernism and postmodernism. What is the difference between both these movements? How they are different from each other? What do you understand by the term magic realism, and how do you see this as a movement? So how this magic realism as a movement comes to you, or what do you understand by this movement? Discuss some of the movements started in art first and then moved to literature later. So these are the important questions that you can discuss, and these are the references. So thank you friends.